Philmont, 2011. It's a story of 10 individuals traveling for over 14 days on one trip of a lifetime. All scouts woke up early in the morning to get to the airport. We traveled from Providence to Detroit to Denver, and over Detroit we even saw the great automobile plants. Upon arrival in Denver, we had to take a bus trip from Denver to the United States Air Force Academy. On our tour of the academy, we saw planes, statues, and some spectacular architecture. Inside the Air Force Chapel, there was a Catholic section, a Protestant section. There was also even a small Buddhist section. After the Air Force Academy, we traveled to Pikes Peak, where we shopped, and these red cars were going to take us by cable to its peak. On the way up, some scouts even chose to use it as a way of catching up on sleep from earlier. Others chose to take in the sights and sounds that Pikes Peak offered. It was at the peak where we first encountered a Rocky Mountain High. After a short night's sleep, we had another long bus ride in front of us as we traveled through Colorado and into the Arkansas River, where we were going to go whitewater rafting. After a few moments of relaxation, taking in the local sights and sounds, we were all set and ready for some adventure aboard the Arkansas River. After a long day of whitewater rafting, we were herded back into the bus, except this time traveling to the Koshari Indian Museum, where we would stay for the night. The kiva that we stayed in was the largest self-supporting log structure in the entire world. We also had the pleasure of being entertained by the Koshari Indians as they did traditional music and dances. After another night's sleep, we had another long bus ride in front of us as we finally made our way to the famous Philmont Scout Ranch. On the way, we saw remnants of a wildfire that had devastated the area almost 10 years earlier. After months of preparation and planning, we finally made it to Philmont Scout Ranch in all of its glory. After a few moments' rest, we met our ranger Jake. He and the other rangers did a song about always wanting to go back to Philmont, and we had our first Philmont lunch. After lunch, we began the long and arduous process of collecting supplies for our 10 days of hiking. Some local wildlife even made its way through base camp. We then had a dinner that all scouts ate and enjoyed. After a brief religious service, we were able to check out some local wildlife and the Tooth of Time. Once the sun began to set, it was time for the send-off campfire. The staff regaled us with stories about how Philmont was created. Our fearless crew leader, Alex, was called on stage and given an American flag with instructions, "Do not lose." The next morning, we were all packed and ready to go hiking on the infamous Philmont Scout Ranch. Our hiking trek had finally begun, and we had set off just under the Tooth of Time. Our first stop was a fort owned by oil tycoon Wade Phillips, so his son could play cowboys and Indians. It was there we learned some valuable orienteering skills, as well as heard Jacob and Matt's rendition of the Philmont hymn. One visit to a Red Roof Inn later, and we were on our way to Lover's Leap. It also happened to be our first campsite. A few bear bags later, and we were ready to fall asleep. The next morning, we were off and ready to hike again. This time, we chose the scenic route. A few injuries, animal sightings, rests, and butterscotch, or potentially vanilla-scented trees later, we were at Uraka Mesa. After a hearty welcome, we began Uraka Mesa's team-building exercises. They involved passing six along, gunfighter challenges, fitting 8 people on a 2-square-foot piece of wood, or even climbing through a spider's web. The hardest challenge of all was the 10-foot wall we had to scale as a team. We learned teamwork, communication, and most importantly, spoons, not forks. Afterwards, it was time for dinner, and the signs of the trail were already showing. We might have been dirty everywhere, but we were embracing the Philmont way. A quick show at Uraka Mesa, and it was off to bed for us. We had another important day of hiking ahead of us. At this point, the time in the wilderness had begun to really show on each and every one of us. This was also our first day on the trail without our ranger, which meant that in addition to protecting ourselves from bears that we swear were there in the middle of the night, we also had to find our own direction through the trails. After a little confusion, we finally made it to Crater Lake. In addition to having our itinerary stolen, we also had the chance to spar pole. Spar poling is the process of using boots, a special harness, a brain bucket, as well as a buddy in order to climb to the top of a large piece of timber. Once at the top, the climbers were required to pose the coolest, sickest pose they could, as well as shout the loudest, manliest thing they could muster in order to be able to rappel down. Once at the bottom, we evaluated injuries and then headed back to camp. After some unexpected visitors passing through camp, and of course, no coffee to Mr. Warzika's avail, it was time for the infamous Crater Lake Logging Company show. Despite raining the night before, conditions seemed hot as ever as we made our way up Trail Peak. Once at the top, we paid our respects to the crashed B-24 bomber that had crash-landed there almost 70 years prior. After a trail lunch that consisted of who knows what, we finally made it to Beaubien. It was there we got our first taste of the dreaded mini bear. We branded our equipment, we observed some local wildlife, and because we had the privilege of having a layover at Beaubien, we're able to kick back, relax, and take it easy just for a little bit. The next day, we had to pick up our food for the second half of our trek. We also had the privilege, and I do mean privilege, of being able to take a shower at Beaubien. At this point in the trek, nothing felt better than being clean. I can't say we were clean long though, because up next was horseback riding. While Mr. Whitman began to write his journal, the rest of us were mounting our horses and preparing to ride them throughout Beaubien. While some horses were stubborn, and others were pretty easygoing, they all seemed to have a mind of their own and traveled the path they wanted to. After horseback riding, we had our conservation project. It was supposed to consist of us cutting down shrubs and underbrush, but thanks to Mr. Warzika, we ended up cutting down quite a few trees. Afterwards, we were rewarded with a hearty chuck-wagging dinner, and boy did that taste good. We also had the privilege of meeting the coolest 17-year-old ever. The next day was July 4th, and that meant we had to sing the national anthem. Our next campsite was Crooked Creek, which had cattle that were directly next to our drinking water. Perhaps the only thing sketchier than the water was the homemade outhouses. After a brief nap by all, we made our way to the staff cabin where we were given a brief tour of the 18th century cabin they had constructed. We were also allowed to pose with some of the farm animals they had on Crooked Creek. It wasn't just donkeys, they also had a cow and its baby calf.
Because she is a ranch cattle cow, so. Oh, yeah, you're happy to have friends visiting too, huh?
Are the holes in her ears from other tags?
Directly underneath where that herd is standing contained a stream where we had all our drinking water. It was nasty. To keep our mind off the water, we had to do farm chores, like tend to the chicks, tie up bear bags, and even milk a full-size cow. The most interesting chore of all had to be the poop flinging.
What so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Instant lead, 8.5.
After Crooked Creek, we made our way to Clear Creek, which had a full black powder rifle range. We all could shoot 2 shots out of a black powder rifle at our hats, shoes, or any other clothing. A Boy Scout always makes good use of any free time available. We were given a beaver trapping demonstration, taught to throw tomahawks, and as always, animals were watching our every move, waiting for just a small scrap of food to be dropped. The next day, we traversed Mount Phillips, which at its highest stands almost 12,000 feet in elevation. Special thanks to Mr. Bronsdorf for carrying 5 pounds of Twizzlers to the peak as a treat. After descending Mount Phillips and reascending Comanche Peak, our camp for the night was Thunder Ridge, though our activities for the day were at Cypher's Mine Camp. We were taught how to prospect at the camp, though no one found any gold. We were given a tour of Cypher's Mine, which included leaving in pitch-black darkness. We had our regular camp dinner, and were able to watch Stomp before going to bed. The next day was by far our longest day of hiking. First, we went to Cimarroncito, where we were given a chance to boulder. Boulder is a form of harnessless, ropeless rock climbing. We had to then stop at the commissary for our last bit of food, where everyone also picked up a treat, fresh fruit. We then hiked to our camp for the night, Cathedral Rock. By this point in our trip, everyone let themselves go, and we were covered in our own filth. While Cathedral Rock was beautiful, the stream running through it ran dry, so in order to cook our food, we had to improvise and find the closest water source. The next day, we traveled through Clark's Fork, saw some danger signs, and saw some old landmarks. Finally, after seeing the Tooth of Time almost every day on our trip, we made it to Tooth Ridge. It was there that we saw the Latrine Backpacker magazine ranked number 2 in the world. As we climbed the Tooth of Time, and finally, after 10 days, reached its peak, it was hard, whether it be the filth we had collected, or the injuries that we sustained, As we looked out and saw all the places we had been earlier, it was hard not to think about how we've each grown as individuals and grown as an entire group. The next morning, we woke up early to watch the sunrise off of Tooth Ridge. Then we began the home stretch, our final day of hiking before we finally reached base camp. It was a momentous occasion. We all finally made it. We finally got a chance to eat a real meal. We finally got a chance to clean, and we went from our dirty, disgusting trail selves to squeaky clean citizens once again. Mr. Warzika was even able to retire his boots that had been there all along. After hiking, we were able to check out the Philmont Museum, as well as being able to eat one last meal before the closing campfire. The next morning we had an early breakfast because we had to drive from Philmont to Denver and then fly from Denver to Detroit back home into Providence. And thus concludes 14 days that each and every one of us will always remember.